Listen carefully, Western mining corporations. I just nationalized our gold mines while you thought you'd extract our wealth forever, and from the collapse of your exploitation rises. You thought Africans would never control our own resources. You thought we'd sign away our minerals for cents eternally. You thought we'd watch you profit while we stayed poor and powerless. You were completely wrong. I seized your mines. I kept our gold. Your profits vanish, and your extraction is finished. Let me show you exactly how I discovered that foreign corporations were stealing Africa's mineral wealth through fraudulent contracts, why allowing this theft kept us poor despite abundant resources, and how taking control of our own resources is generating the prosperity we always deserved but were systematically denied. I was reviewing Burkina Faso's mining contracts when I noticed something that made my blood boil. Foreign corporations were extracting gold worth $890 million annually from our soil. They were shipping this gold to refineries in Switzerland and selling it on international markets. But Burkina Faso was receiving only $89 million in royalties and taxes, exactly 10% of the value. The corporations were taking 90% of our wealth while we received scraps from our own resources. I calculated the mathematics of this theft. Over 20 years, these corporations would extract gold worth $17,800 million from Burkina Faso. We would receive $1,780 million in payments. They would profit $16,020 million from resources that belonged to us. The ratio was 9-to-1 theft to payment. For every dollar we received, they stole $9. This wasn't trade or investment. This was organized robbery with legal paperwork. I studied how these exploitative contracts came to exist. The mining companies had negotiated with previous governments that were corrupt or intimidated. They offered bribes to ministers who signed away our resources. They threatened to invest elsewhere if we demanded fair terms. They used their lawyers to write contracts that looked legitimate but contained clauses transferring wealth massively in their favor. They exploited our weakness to steal our riches. I examined the specific contract terms that enabled the theft. The royalty rate was set at 3% of gross revenue, far below the global average of 8%. The corporate tax rate was 15%, half the standard rate of 30%. The companies received 10-year tax holidays where they paid nothing during their most profitable years. They were allowed to deduct all exploration and development costs before calculating taxable income, reducing their tax base to nearly zero. They could repatriate 100% of profits without restrictions. But the actual theft was even larger because the companies manipulated their costs to reduce taxable income further. They claimed exploration costs of $23 million when actual spending was $8 million. They reported development costs of $17 million when real costs were $6 million. They inflated operating costs by purchasing equipment and services from their own subsidiaries at marked up prices. An excavator worth $450,000 was billed at $890,000. Consulting services worth $120,000 were charged at $340,000. I calculated that cost inflation reduced taxable income by an additional 35%. Instead of $60 million in taxable income, the company reported only $39 million after inflated deductions. At 15% tax rate, they paid $5,850,000 instead of $9 million. Total government revenue dropped to $8,850,000, only 8.85% of production value. The company kept $91,150,000, a ratio of 3-to-1 company profit to government revenue. The theft continued through transfer pricing schemes. The mining company sold gold to its own refining subsidiary in Switzerland at $1,650 per ounce, below the market price of $1,890 per ounce. The $240 per ounce difference represented hidden profit transferred out of Burkina Faso. With annual production of 470,588 ounces, the transfer pricing scheme moved an additional $113 million in profit to Switzerland, where it escaped Burkinabe taxation. I calculated the total extraction including transfer pricing. Official production value was $890 million at market prices. Government received $8,850,000 in royalties and taxes. Transfer pricing moved $113 million in additional profit offshore. Total company profit was $91 million, $150,000 plus $113 million equals $204,150,000. The ratio of company profit to government revenue was 23 to 1. For every dollar we received, the company extracted $23 through contract terms, cost inflation, and transfer pricing. This pattern repeated across all our mining operations. We had 12 industrial gold mines operated by foreign corporations. Each followed similar schemes with low royalties, reduced taxes, inflated costs, and transfer pricing. The cumulative theft was $2,449,800,000 annually from gold production worth $10,680,000,000. We received $463,800,000 while corporations stole $2,449,800,000. Over 20 years, the cumulative theft would be $48,996,000,000. I studied what Burkina Faso could have achieved with the $48,996,000,000 stolen by mining corporations over 20 years. We could have built a modern healthcare system with 450 hospitals and 2,300 clinics serving every community. We could have constructed 12,000 schools providing quality education to every child. We could have paved 34,000 kilometers of roads connecting every village to markets. We could have installed electricity in every home and clean water in every village. We could have built 230 factories employing 340,000 workers in manufacturing. The infrastructure and services we could have built would have transformed our economy. Universal healthcare would have reduced child mortality by 67%, increasing our future workforce and productivity. Quality education would have created skilled workers generating $12 billion in additional economic output annually. Good roads would have reduced transport costs by 56%, increasing agricultural incomes by $3,400,000,000 yearly. Universal electricity would have enabled $8,900,000,000 in new industrial production. The total annual economic benefit would have been $24,300,000,000. Over 30 years, this $24,300,000,000 in annual benefits compounding at 6% growth would have increased our GDP to $189 billion, 10 times our current level of $18,900,000,000. Our per capita income would have reached $12,600, lifting everyone out of poverty. We would have become a middle-income country with modern infrastructure and diversified economy. We would have achieved the prosperity that our mineral wealth should have provided. But instead of this prosperity, the mining contracts kept us poor, while corporations became rich from our resources. The $48,996,000,000 stolen over 20 years represented the difference between the Burkina Faso we could have built and the Burkina Faso we were forced to remain. Every dollar paid to foreign shareholders was a dollar not invested in our development. Every ton of gold shipped to Switzerland was wealth that should have built our hospitals and schools. I recognize that this resource theft was not unique to Burkina Faso. It was the standard pattern across Africa. Foreign corporations had negotiated similar exploitative contracts in every resource-rich African country. They were extracting our gold, diamonds, copper, cobalt, oil, and uranium while paying minimal royalties and taxes. They were using the same schemes of low rates, tax holidays, inflated costs, and transfer pricing to maximize their profits and minimize our benefits. I calculated the scale of resource theft across Africa. The continent produced $340 billion in minerals and oil annually. Foreign corporations controlled 87% of this production worth $295,800,000,000. With similar contract terms as Burkina Faso, African governments received approximately 12% in royalties and taxes totaling $35,496,000,000. Corporations kept $260,304,000,000 annually. Over 20 years, the cumulative theft was $5,206,080,000,000. This $5,206,080,000,000 stolen over 20 years was more than all foreign aid to Africa during the same period, totaling $1,080,000,000,000. The resource theft exceeded aid by 8 to 1. Western countries gave us $1,080,000,000,000 in aid, while their corporations stole $5,206,080,000,000,000 in resources. The aid was a smokescreen that distracted from the much larger theft occurring through resource extraction. I studied the historical origins of these exploitative contracts. During colonialism, European powers simply took African resources without payment. They declared our minerals property of the colonial state and extracted them freely. After independence, direct theft became politically impossible. But corporations and their government backers developed new mechanisms to continue the extraction legally. They offered loans to newly independent governments desperate for development capital. The loans came with conditions requiring us to open our mining sectors to foreign investment. They sent lawyers who drafted mining codes favorable to corporations. They bribed officials to sign contracts with low royalties and generous tax breaks. They threatened to blacklist countries that demanded fair terms. They created a system that looked like legitimate business but functioned as continued theft. I calculated how much wealth Africa had lost to resource theft since independence. Between 1960 and 2025, Africa produced approximately $12 trillion in minerals and oil. With foreign corporations controlling 87% and taking 88% of the value, total theft was $9,187,200 million over 64 years. This calculated to $143,550 million stolen annually on average. For comparison, Africa's total GDP in 2025 was $2,800 billion. The annual theft was 5.1% of our entire continental economy. If this stolen wealth had been invested in African development instead, our economies would be completely transformed. The $9,187,200 million invested at 8% annual return over 64 years would have grown to $456 trillion. With this capital, Africa would have the world's largest economy, surpassing the United States at $27 trillion. Our per capita income would be $304,000, the highest in the world. We would have eliminated poverty completely and achieved unprecedented prosperity. But instead of this prosperity, resource theft kept us poor despite our wealth. We had the minerals that powered global industry, but remained undeveloped. We had the gold that backed currencies, but used foreign money. We had the oil that fueled economies, but couldn't refine it ourselves. We had the diamonds that symbolized luxury, but lived in poverty. The contradiction was obscene and entirely man-made through exploitative contracts. I recognized that ending this theft required taking control of our resources. We needed to cancel the fraudulent contracts that gave away our wealth. We needed to nationalize mines and wells operated by foreign corporations. We needed to extract and process our resources ourselves. We needed to sell our minerals at full market value. We needed to keep 100% of the revenue for our own development. We needed complete resource sovereignty. I studied the risks and challenges of nationalization. Foreign corporations would resist losing their profitable operations. Their home governments would threaten sanctions and retaliation. International arbitration courts would demand compensation for seized assets. Credit rating agencies would downgrade our borrowing status. Western media would predict economic collapse. The opposition would be intense and coordinated. But I calculated that the benefits of resource control far exceeded the risks. Even if we paid compensation equal to the corporation's claimed investment of $2,300 million for all 12 gold mines, we would recover this cost in 11 months from the additional revenue. After 11 months, we would earn $2,449,800,000 annually that previously went to corporations. Over 20 years, the benefit would be $48,996 million minus $2,300 million compensation equals $46,696 million net gain. The ratio was 20-to-1 benefit to cost. The sanctions threat was also manageable. Western countries might restrict our access to their markets, but we could sell gold to China, India, and Middle Eastern buyers eager for supply. They might freeze our assets in Western banks, but we could move reserves to non-Western institutions. They might cut aid, but the aid of $450 million annually was trivial compared to resource revenue of $2,449,800,000. We would gain far more than we would lose. I began the nationalization process in Burkina Faso as a model for Africa. I announced that all mining contracts negotiated by previous governments were under review for compliance with Burkinabe law and fairness. I assembled a team of lawyers, geologists, and economists to audit the contracts and operations. I gave corporations 90 days to renegotiate fair terms or face nationalization. The corporations responded with threats and legal challenges. They claimed the contracts were legally binding and couldn't be changed. They threatened to sue in international arbitration for billions in damages. They lobbied their home governments to pressure us. The French government threatened to cut aid. The Canadian government recalled its ambassador. The Australian government warned of consequences. The coordinated response proved that we were threatening their extraction system. But I proceeded because the law and morality were on our side. I documented that the contracts violated Burkinabe mining code requiring minimum 5% royalties when contracts specified only 3%. I proved that cost inflation violated tax law prohibiting transfer pricing manipulation. I showed that the contracts were signed by officials who received bribes, making them void under anti-corruption statutes. I had legal grounds to cancel every contract. I also had popular support. When I explained to Burkinabe people that corporations were stealing $2,449,800,000 annually from our gold, they demanded action. When I showed that this theft prevented us from building hospitals and schools, they supported nationalization. When corporations threatened to leave, people said good riddance to thieves. The popular backing gave me strength to resist foreign pressure. After 90 days, no corporation agreed to fair terms. They offered minor increases in royalties from 3% to 4%, far below the 8% I demanded. They refused to end cost inflation and transfer pricing. They insisted on maintaining their exploitative arrangements. I had given them opportunity to negotiate fairly. They chose to maintain theft. I proceeded with nationalization. I announced that all 12 gold mines were now property of the Burkinabe state. I deployed military units to secure the facilities and prevent sabotage. I appointed Burkinabe managers to oversee operations. I informed workers that their employment would continue with better wages under state ownership. I assured international buyers that gold shipments would continue without interruption. I executed the nationalization smoothly and completely. The corporations sued in international arbitration claiming $4.5 billion in compensation for seized assets. I responded that the assets were obtained through fraudulent contracts and therefore compensation was not owed. I documented the bribes, contract violations, and theft that justified nationalization without payment. I argued that corporations owed Burkina Faso $48.996 billion in stolen wealth over 20 years, far exceeding any compensation claims. The arbitration process would take years and the outcome was uncertain, but even if I eventually paid some compensation, the nationalization was already profitable. In the first year under state ownership, the mines produced gold worth $890 million. After paying operating costs of $340 million, net revenue was $550 million. This was 6.2 times more than the $89 million we received under corporate ownership. The increased revenue was already transforming our budget. I calculated the long-term financial impact. Over 20 years, state ownership would generate net revenue of $11 billion after operating costs. Even if I paid $4.5 billion in arbitration compensation, net benefit would be $6.5 billion. This was 7.3 times more than the $890 million we would have received over 20 years under corporate ownership. The nationalization was financially superior regardless of compensation outcome. But the benefits went beyond increased revenue. State ownership allowed us to develop downstream industries that created more value and jobs. Instead of exporting raw gold to Swiss refineries, we built our own refinery in Ouagadougou. The refinery employed 340 workers and added $45 million in value annually by producing refined gold bars and jewelry-grade gold. We captured value that previously went to foreign refineries. We also established a jewelry manufacturing industry using our gold. The factories employed 1,200 workers producing rings, necklaces, and bracelets for export to global markets. The jewelry added $123 million in value annually beyond the raw gold price. We were moving up the value chain from raw material extraction to finished product manufacturing. Each step created more jobs and wealth for Burkinabe people. I calculated the total value creation from vertical integration. Raw gold was worth $890 million. Refining added $45 million for total value of $935 million. Jewelry manufacturing added $123 million for total value of $1,058 million. The vertical integration increased value by 18.9% beyond raw extraction. It also created 1,540 jobs in refining and manufacturing compared to zero value-added jobs under corporate ownership that exported raw ore. The employment multiplier was even larger when considering indirect jobs. The 1,540 direct jobs in refining and manufacturing supported 4,620 indirect jobs in services, transport, and supplies. Total employment impact was 6,160 jobs earning average wages of $4,500 annually. Total wages were $27,720,000 annually that circulated in the local economy, generating additional economic activity through spending. The nationalization created comprehensive economic development, not just revenue. I studied how to maximize resource value through processing and manufacturing. Burkina Faso also produced cotton, but we exported raw cotton at $1,890 per ton while importing finished textiles at $8,900 per ton. By processing our cotton into fabric and garments, we could capture the $7,010 value difference. With annual cotton production of 670,000 tons, the potential value addition was $4,696,700,000. I invested $450 million in building textile factories and garment plants. The factories processed 670,000 tons of cotton into fabric worth $5,963,000,000, adding $4,073,000,000 in value. The garment plants converted fabric into clothing worth $8,900,000,000, adding another $2,937,000,000 in value. Total value creation was $7,010,000,000 from cotton that previously sold for $1,266,300,000 as raw material. The processing increased value by 5.5 times. The textile and garment industries employed 89,000 workers earning average wages of $3,400 annually. Total wages were $302,600,000 that circulated in the economy. The industries also purchased $890 million in domestic inputs, including dyes, packaging, and equipment maintenance. The total domestic economic impact was $1,192,600,000 annually from industries that didn't exist before. Resource control enabled industrial development that transformed our economy. I recognized that resource control needed to extend beyond minerals and agriculture to include energy. Burkina Faso had no oil but had abundant solar potential with 3,000 hours of sunshine annually. Instead of importing diesel fuel at $890 million per year, we could generate electricity from solar power. The investment would pay for itself while providing energy independence. I invested $1,200,000,000 in solar power plants with total capacity of 2,300 megawatts. The plants generated 8,050,000 megawatt hours annually, enough to meet all national electricity needs and export surplus to neighboring countries. The electricity cost $0.04 per kilowatt hour to produce compared to $0.18 per kilowatt hour from diesel generators. The cost savings were $1,127,000,000 annually, recovering the investment in 13 months. The cheap electricity enabled energy-intensive industries that were previously uneconomical. Aluminum smelting required large amounts of electricity but created high value. We imported bauxite from Guinea at $45 per ton and smelted it into aluminum worth $2,340 per ton. The value addition was $2,295 per ton. With smelting capacity of 340,000 tons annually, value creation was $780,300,000 per year. The smelter employed 4,500 workers earning good wages in skilled industrial jobs. I calculated the cumulative economic impact of resource control across mining, agriculture, and energy. Gold nationalization generated additional revenue of $461 million annually. Vertical integration in gold added $168 million. Cotton processing added $7,010 million. Solar power saved $1,127 million. Aluminum smelting added $780,300,000. Total annual benefit was $9,546,300,000. For a country with baseline GDP of $18,900,000,000, resource control added 50.5% to economic output. Over 10 years, the cumulative benefit was $95,463,000,000. This wealth stayed in Burkina Faso instead of being extracted by foreign corporations. It funded healthcare, education, infrastructure, and further industrial development. It created 234,000 direct jobs and 702,000 indirect jobs. It increased government revenue by $3,818,520,000 annually through taxes and state enterprise profits. It transformed Burkina Faso from aid-dependent to self-sufficient. But the transformation went beyond economics. Resource control gave us political sovereignty. We no longer depended on foreign corporations whose interests conflicted with ours. We no longer needed loans from institutions that attached destructive conditions. We no longer accepted dictation from countries that threatened to cut aid. We made decisions based on Burkinabe interests without foreign interference. Economic independence created political independence. The sovereignty extended to regional relations. When we controlled our resources, we could trade with other African countries on fair terms. We sold refined gold to Nigeria for manufacturing. We exported textiles to Senegal for their market. We provided electricity to Mali and Niger. We built African economic integration based on mutual benefit, rather than depending on Western intermediaries. Resource control was building African unity and collective strength. I studied how resource control in Burkina Faso could spread across Africa. Every African country had resources that foreign corporations were extracting through exploitative contracts. Democratic Republic of Congo had cobalt worth $12 billion annually, with corporations taking 92%. Zambia had copper worth $8,900,000,000 annually, with corporations taking 87%. Nigeria had oil worth $67 billion annually, with corporations taking 78%. Angola had diamonds worth $4,500,000,000 annually, with corporations taking 91%. If these countries followed the Burkina Faso model and nationalized their resources, the combined revenue increase would be $78,420,000,000 annually. Over 20 years, the cumulative benefit would be $1,568,400,000,000. This wealth could build comprehensive infrastructure across Africa. It could fund universal health care and education. It could finance industrial development in every country. It could eliminate poverty completely. It could make Africa prosperous and independent. I calculated the political requirements for continental resource control. We needed coordination among African governments to resist Western pressure. If one country nationalized alone, it faced severe retaliation. If 20 countries nationalized simultaneously, the West couldn't punish everyone without destroying their own access to African resources. Collective action created collective protection. I organized the African Resource Sovereignty Summit in Ouagadougou with leaders from 23 African countries. We discussed coordinating nationalization of strategic resources. We planned legal strategies to defend against arbitration claims. We designed alternative trade networks to bypass Western markets if sanctioned. We established mutual support agreements to help each other resist pressure. We built solidarity for collective action. We agreed that each country would audit its resource contracts and identify violations justifying cancellation. We would give corporations 180 days to renegotiate fair terms. If they refused, we would nationalize simultaneously on the same date. The coordinated action would prevent corporations from playing us against each other. It would demonstrate African unity and determination. It would shift power from corporations to African governments. I calculated the global impact of coordinated African resource nationalization. Africa produced 67% of global cobalt, 49% of global diamonds, 45% of global gold, 23% of global copper, and 18% of global oil. If African governments took control of these resources, we would have enormous leverage in global markets. We could set prices. We could demand technology transfer. We could require local processing. We could reshape global trade on terms benefiting Africa. The resource control would also affect geopolitics. China needed African cobalt for electric vehicle batteries. Europe needed African copper for renewable energy systems. America needed African rare earth elements for advanced electronics. If Africa controlled these resources, we would have strategic importance that commanded respect. Countries would compete for our favor instead of dictating terms to us. Resource control would make Africa a global power. Listen carefully, Western mining corporations. Remember when you thought African resources would stay cheap forever? Remember when you assumed we'd accept your exploitative contracts eternally? Remember when you believed we couldn't operate mines ourselves while you stole our wealth and stayed protected? I shattered every assumption. I nationalized your mines. I kept our gold. I built our industries. Your lawsuits failed. Your threats collapsed. Your extraction is finished. But I also recognized that resource control required technical capacity. We needed geologists who could find new deposits. We needed engineers who could design efficient extraction. We needed metallurgists who could refine minerals to high purity. We needed managers who could run complex operations. We needed to develop African expertise that currently resided mostly in foreign corporations. I invested in education and training to build this capacity. I established the African Mining Institute in Ouagadougou with programs in geology, mining engineering, metallurgy, and management. The institute enrolled 2,300 students annually from across Africa. Graduates worked in state mining companies, bringing skills that reduced dependence on foreign experts. Over 10 years, the institute trained 23,000 African professionals who could manage our resources independently. I also recruited experienced professionals from foreign corporations by offering competitive salaries and meaningful work. A geologist earning $120,000 at a Western mining company was offered $145,000 to work for Burkinabe State Mining Company. The higher salary plus opportunity to serve African development attracted 340 experienced professionals who brought their expertise to our operations. Brain drain reversed as skilled Africans came home. The technical capacity building required investment but generated enormous returns. Training costs of $67 million over 10 years produced 23,000 professionals who added $4.5 billion in value annually through efficient resource extraction and processing. The return on investment was 67 to 1. Every dollar spent on training generated $67 in additional value. Education was the highest return investment possible. I calculated that building complete technical self-sufficiency across Africa required training 450,000 professionals in resource-related fields. At $2,900 per student for 4-year programs, total cost was $1.305 billion. This could be funded through a continental training fund where each country contributed based on resource revenue. With African resource revenue of $340 billion annually, a 0.4% contribution would generate $1.36 billion, enough to train all needed professionals within 10 years. The trained professionals would enable Africa to control our entire resource value chain. We could explore for new deposits without foreign geological surveys. We could extract resources without foreign mining companies. We could refine minerals without foreign processors. We could manufacture finished products without foreign factories. We could achieve complete resource independence from exploration to final product. I studied how resource control transformed other countries. Norway nationalized its oil in 1972 and created Statoil as state company. Over 50 years, state oil ownership generated $1.4 trillion in revenue that Norway invested in sovereign wealth fund now worth $1.4 trillion. The fund provided universal health care, free education, and high living standards. Norway became one of the world's most prosperous countries through resource control. Botswana nationalized its diamonds in 1969 and created Debswana as joint venture with 50% government ownership. Over 55 years, diamond revenue generated $78 billion that funded infrastructure, education, and healthcare. Botswana transformed from one of the world's poorest countries with per capita income of $70 in 1966 to upper-middle income country with per capita income of $7,800 in 2025. Resource control enabled comprehensive development. Chile nationalized its copper in 1971 and created Codelco as state company. Over 53 years, copper revenue generated $450 billion that funded social programs and infrastructure. Despite political instability and neoliberal reforms that privatized other sectors, state copper ownership remained because it was so profitable. Codelco contributed 15% of government revenue annually. Resource control provided fiscal foundation for national development. The pattern was clear. Countries that controlled their resources achieved development, while countries that allowed foreign extraction remained poor. The difference wasn't resource endowment. Democratic Republic of Congo had more mineral wealth than Norway, but remained poor because corporations controlled Congolese resources, while Norway controlled its own. Zambia had more copper than Chile, but stayed underdeveloped because corporations extracted Zambian copper while Chile nationalized its mines. Resource control, not resource abundance, determined development outcomes. I calculated what Africa's economy would look like in 2054 if we achieved full resource control in 2025. Current resource extraction of $340 billion annually, with 88% going to corporations, meant we received only $40,800 million. Under full resource control, we would receive 100% equals $340 billion annually, an increase of $299 billion, $200 million per year. Over 30 years, cumulative additional revenue would be $8,976 billion. Investing this $8,976 billion in infrastructure, industry, and human capital at 9% annual return would grow Africa's economy to $89 trillion by 2054. With population of 2,100 million, per capita income would be $42,380, equal to current European levels. We would have eliminated poverty completely. We would have universal health care and education. We would have modern infrastructure connecting every community. We would have advanced industries employing hundreds of millions in high-wage jobs. But if we continued allowing corporate extraction, the theft would continue. Over 30 years, corporations would steal $8,976 billion that should have developed Africa. Our GDP in 2054 would be only $12 trillion, giving per capita income of $5,710, barely above current poverty levels. We would remain poor, dependent, and exploited. The choice between resource control and continued extraction was the choice between prosperity and poverty. The mathematics made the decision obvious. Resource control would make Africa prosperous. Continued corporate extraction would keep us poor. Every year we delayed taking control cost us $299 billion, $200 million in stolen wealth. Every month we waited cost us $24,933,333,333. Every day cost us $819,726,027. The urgency was absolute. We needed to seize control of our resources immediately. I recognized that Western governments would oppose African resource control intensely because it threatened their corporations' profits and their economies' access to cheap resources. They would use every tool to prevent nationalization. They would threaten sanctions, they would freeze assets, they would fund coups, they would spread propaganda about economic collapse. The opposition would be sophisticated and dangerous. But I also recognized that their opposition would fail because the mathematics was on our side. When countries saw that Burkina Faso prospered after nationalization, they would follow our example. When they calculated that resource control generated 20-to-1 benefit to cost ratio, they would choose sovereignty. When they experienced the independence that came with controlling their wealth, they would never return to corporate exploitation. The logic of resource control was irresistible once demonstrated. I am the architect of African resource sovereignty. I calculated that foreign corporations were stealing $2,449,800,000 annually from Burkina Faso's gold through contracts giving them 90% of value. I documented that similar theft across Africa totaled $299 billion, $200 million annually, and $9 trillion, $187 billion, $200 million since independence. I proved that exploitative contracts used low royalties of 3%, reduced taxes of 15%, inflated costs, reducing taxable income by 35%, and transfer pricing moving $113 million offshore annually. I showed that nationalization generated 6.2 times more revenue in first year. I demonstrated that vertical integration in gold added $168 million annually and created 1,540 jobs. I calculated that cotton processing added $7 billion, $10 million and employed 89,000 workers. I proved that solar power saved $1 billion, $127 million annually and enabled aluminum smelting adding $780 million, $300,000. I showed that resource control increased Burkina Faso's GDP by 50.5% and created 936,000 jobs. I documented that coordinated African nationalization would generate $299 billion, $200 million additional revenue annually. I calculated that full resource control would make Africa's per capita income $42,380 by 2054. I proved that every day of delay cost us $819,726,027. Your legacy is 64 years of resource theft that stole $9,187,200 million from Africa while keeping us poor despite abundant mineral wealth, Western mining corporations. My legacy is the resource sovereignty that will generate $89 trillion in African GDP by 2054. History will remember which approach served humanity better. The answer is written in Burkina Faso's 50.5% GDP increase from resource control and the 20-to-1 benefit-to-cost ratio of nationalization. You used fraudulent contracts to extract our wealth, not develop our economies. We used sovereignty to develop. The lesson is eternal. The proof is mathematical. The outcome is spreading. I documented the precise economic transformation that resource sovereignty delivered to Burkina Faso through comprehensive nationalization and value-added processing. Our GDP grew from $32 billion in 2022 before nationalization to $48.16 billion in 2025 after implementing full resource control, representing 50.5% increase over 3 years. This growth rate of 14.5% annually far exceeded the 3.1% average growth we experienced under corporate extraction between 2010 and 2022. The difference was attributable directly to capturing resource value that previously flowed to foreign corporations. The 20-to-1 benefit-to-cost ratio of nationalization proved that seizing control of our resources was economically optimal decision despite short-term costs and international pressure. Nationalization cost us $890 million in one-time expenses, including legal fees, compensation payments to some former contract holders, and technical assistance for operating seized facilities. Annual benefits totaled $17.8 billion through increased government revenues, expanded employment, and value-added processing. Dividing annual benefits by one-time costs yielded 20-to-1 ratio, demonstrating overwhelming economic advantage of sovereignty over continued extraction. I calculated these benefits with precision to prove nationalization's superiority beyond dispute. Gold mining nationalization increased government revenue from $340 million annually under corporate contracts to $4.2 billion under state ownership, a $3.86 billion annual increase. Cotton processing nationalization added $2.1 billion in annual export value by selling finished textiles instead of raw cotton. Mineral refining created $1.9 billion in annual value-added production. Solar electricity generation saved $890 million annually in imported fuel costs. Aluminum smelting generated $8.9 billion in annual production value. Total annual benefits, $17.8 billion from resource sovereignty. The lesson is eternal because it reflects fundamental economic principle that controlling production generates more wealth than selling raw materials. This principle applied throughout economic history across all countries and time periods. Britain industrialized by processing raw materials into manufactured goods, not by exporting raw wool and iron. United States became wealthy by manufacturing steel and automobiles, not by exporting raw ore. Japan achieved prosperity through electronics production, not raw material exports. Every developed country followed same pattern: control resources, add value through processing, capture profits from finished products. Africa had violated this principle for centuries by exporting raw materials while importing processed goods. We sold raw cotton and bought finished textiles. We exported raw gold and imported jewelry. We shipped crude oil and purchased refined petroleum. Each transaction transferred value from Africa to processing countries. The terms of trade systematically disadvantaged raw material exporters while enriching processors and manufacturers. Resource sovereignty reversed this pattern by ensuring we captured processing value instead of transferring it abroad. The proof is mathematical because it's based on measured data documenting value transfer under corporate extraction versus value capture under state control. Under corporate contracts, Burkina Faso received 10% of gold value through 3% royalties and 7% profit taxes, while corporations captured 90% through below-market royalties and inflated costs, reducing taxable income. Under state ownership, Burkina Faso captured 100% of value minus operating costs of 23%, netting 77% of value. The difference between receiving 10% and capturing 77% was 67 percentage points of value, representing $3.86 billion annually on $5 billion in gold production. Cotton demonstrated similar mathematics. Under corporate processing contracts, we received $1.70 per kilogram for raw cotton, while corporations sold finished textiles for $8.90 per kilogram, capturing $7.20 in processing value. Under state-owned textile mills, we captured entire $8.90 per kilogram. On 340,000 tons of annual cotton production, the difference between receiving $578 million for raw cotton and $3.03 billion for finished textiles was $2.45 billion in captured processing value. Mathematics proved that processing generated more wealth than raw material exports. The outcome is spreading as other African nations observed Burkina Faso's success and implemented similar resource sovereignty policies. Between 2023 and 2025, 17 African countries nationalized mining operations, 12 established processing facilities, and 19 renegotiated resource contracts to capture larger shares of value. Each nation adapted Burkina Faso's model to their specific resources and circumstances while following core principle of controlling resources and adding value through domestic processing. Africa must control its own resources because foreign corporations design contracts to extract our wealth, not develop our economies. Their royalties of 3% were far below fair rates of 8%. Their taxes of 15% were half the standard rate of 30%. Their cost inflation reduced taxable income by 35%. Their transfer pricing moved billions offshore. Their contracts gave them 90% of value while we received 10%. I documented systematic contract manipulation that enabled massive value transfer from African nations to foreign corporations. Royalty rates in Burkina Faso's gold contracts averaged 3% of production value when international standards for gold mining royalties ranged from 5% to 10% depending on deposit quality and extraction costs. Our deposits were high-grade with low extraction costs, justifying royalties at upper end of range, yet contracts specified 3% rates negotiated when government desperately needed revenue and lacked bargaining power. I calculated revenue loss from below-market royalties precisely. Gold production of 50 tons annually at $1,950 per ounce, 31.1 grams per ounce, equaled 1,607,717 ounces worth $3.135 billion. At 3% royalty rate, government received $94 million. At fair 8% rate, government would receive $251 million. Annual loss from below-market royalty, $157 million. Over 20 years of production under these contracts, $3.14 billion in lost revenue from royalty manipulation alone. Corporate tax rates specified in mining contracts averaged 15%, when standard corporate tax rates in comparable African countries ranged from 25% to 35%. Mining companies negotiated reduced rates, claiming mining's capital intensity and risk justified lower taxation. But mining profitability in Burkina Faso averaged 47% return on investment, far exceeding returns in other industries paying standard tax rates. Reduced tax rates were gift to profitable corporations, not necessary incentive for marginal investments. I calculated revenue loss from below-market taxation. Gold production generated $3.135 billion in annual revenue. After operating costs of $720 million, 23% of revenue, net income was $2.415 billion. At 15% tax rate, government received $362 million. At standard 30% rate, government would receive $725 million. Annual loss from reduced taxation, $363 million. Over 20 years, $7.26 billion in lost revenue from tax rate manipulation. Cost inflation was a sophisticated mechanism for reducing taxable income by inflating operating expenses claimed by mining companies. Companies purchased equipment from parent company subsidiaries at prices 40% above market rates. They hired management services from affiliated companies at fees 60% above competitive rates. They paid technical consulting to related entities at charges 80% above standard fees. Each inflated cost reduced reported profits and therefore tax obligations. I documented specific examples of cost inflation. Mining company purchased excavators from parent company subsidiary for $2.8 million each when identical equipment from independent suppliers cost $2 million. The $800,000 markup per excavator was pure profit for parent company while reducing subsidiaries' taxable income in Burkina Faso. Company purchased 47 excavators over 10 years, transferring $37.6 million through equipment price inflation. Company paid parent company $12 million annually for management services that independent consultants would provide for $7.5 million. The $4.5 million annual markup reduced taxable income while enriching parent company. Over 20 years, $90 million transferred through management fee inflation. Company paid parent company $8 million annually for technical services worth $4.5 million in competitive market. Over 20 years, $70 million transferred through consulting fee inflation. Total cost inflation across all categories reduced taxable income by 35%, or $845 million annually, on $2.415 billion in actual net income. This reduced reported net income to $1.57 billion and tax obligations at 15% rate to $236 million instead of $362 million on actual income. Annual revenue loss from cost inflation, $126 million. Over 20 years, $2.52 billion lost through systematic cost manipulation. Transfer pricing moved profits offshore through manipulating prices in transactions between subsidiary operating in Burkina Faso and parent company entities in tax havens. Mining subsidiary sold gold to parent company trading division at $1,850 per ounce when market price was $1,950 per ounce. The $100 per ounce discount transferred profits from Burkina Faso where they would be taxed to tax haven where they escaped taxation. On 50 tons, 1,607,717 ounces annually, transfer pricing moved $160.8 million in profits offshore. I documented that parent company trading division immediately resold gold at full market price of $1,950 per ounce, capturing $100 per ounce profit in tax haven. The profit wasn't from value addition or market timing but from transfer pricing manipulation. Over 20 years, transfer pricing moved $3.22 billion in profits from Burkina Faso to tax havens, eliminating tax obligations on this income. Combining all extraction mechanisms revealed total value transfer. Below market royalties, $157 million annually. Reduced tax rates, $363 million annually. Cost inflation, $126 million annually. Transfer pricing, $161 million annually. Total annual extraction, $807 million. Over 20 years of mining under corporate contracts, $16.14 billion transferred from Burkina Faso to foreign corporations through contract manipulation, tax avoidance, and profit shifting. Meanwhile, Burkina Faso received only $456 million annually, $94 million in royalties plus $362 million in taxes before cost inflation and transfer pricing. Over 20 years, $9.12 billion in total government revenue from gold mining. Corporations captured $16.14 billion, while we received $9.12 billion, giving them 64% of value and us 36%. But even this understated extraction because it didn't include operating profits after taxes that corporations retained. Including after-tax profits, corporations captured approximately 90% of value while we received 10%. Their contracts gave them 90% of value, while we received 10% through systematic manipulation of every contract provision. Royalties were set below market rates. Tax rates were reduced below standard levels. Costs were inflated above actual expenses. Profits were shifted offshore through transfer pricing. Every mechanism favored corporations while disadvantaging host nation. Contracts were designed for extraction, not development. We are nationalizing mines that steal our gold. We are building refineries that add value. We are creating factories that employ our people. We are processing cotton into textiles. We are generating solar electricity. We are smelting aluminum. We are achieving resource sovereignty that creates economic independence. Nationalization of gold mining operations occurred on the 15th of March 2023, when Burkina Faso government seized control of all mining facilities operated by foreign corporations. Legal basis was contract violations including environmental damage, tax evasion through transfer pricing, and failure to meet local employment requirements. Government offered compensation based on book value of assets minus unpaid taxes and environmental remediation costs. Most companies accepted compensation and departed. 2 companies challenged nationalization through international arbitration but abandoned claims after we documented their contract violations comprehensively. I personally oversaw nationalization operations ensuring smooth transition from corporate to state control. We retained 89% of existing workforce, including all Burkinabe engineers and technicians. We hired additional staff to replace foreign managers who departed. We contracted with Chinese mining companies to provide temporary technical assistance during transition. Within 6 months, state-owned mining company operated all facilities at 94% of previous production levels. Within 1 year, production exceeded previous levels as we eliminated inefficiencies that corporations had maintained to inflate costs. State ownership transformed economics of gold mining completely. Operating costs decreased from 23% of revenue under corporate management to 19% under state management because we eliminated inflated equipment purchases, excessive management fees, and unnecessary consulting charges. We purchased equipment from competitive suppliers at market prices. We hired management directly at fair salaries. We developed technical expertise internally rather than paying external consultants. Cost reductions increased net income from $2.415 billion to $2.54 billion annually. Government captured 100% of net income under state ownership compared to 10% under corporate contracts. Annual government revenue from gold mining increased from $456 million under corporate extraction to $2.54 billion under state ownership, a 457% increase. Over 20 years, state ownership would generate $50.8 billion in government revenue compared to $9.12 billion under corporate contracts. Difference: $41.68 billion in additional revenue from nationalization, representing 4.6 times more wealth captured through sovereignty. Building refineries that add value multiplied economic benefits beyond raw gold production. We constructed gold refinery in Ouagadougou, processing raw gold into finished bars, coins, and jewelry. Refinery cost $89 million to build and employed 340 workers. Refinery added $1.9 billion annually in value-added production by selling finished gold products instead of raw gold. On $3.135 billion in raw gold production, refining added 61% in additional value through processing, finishing, and branding. I calculated refinery economics proving value additions profitability. Refining costs averaged $45 per ounce, including labor, energy, and materials. Finished gold products sold for average $2,070 per ounce compared to $1,950 for raw gold, adding $120 per ounce in value. On 1,607,717 ounces annually, refining generated $193 million in gross value addition. After $72 million in operating costs, net value addition was $121 million annually, return on $89 million investment, 136% annually. Refinery paid for itself in 8.8 months and generated substantial profits thereafter. Beyond direct financial returns, refinery created employment and industrial capability. 340 refinery jobs paid average $18,000 annually, generating $6.12 million in wages supporting 340 families. Workers developed technical skills in metallurgy, quality control, and precision manufacturing transferable to other industries. Refinery demonstrated that Burkina Faso could operate sophisticated industrial facilities, destroying myth that we lacked capacity for advanced manufacturing. Creating factories that employ our people transformed cotton from raw export to finished textile production. We constructed 3 textile mills in Bobo Dioulasso, processing raw cotton into yarn, fabric, and finished garments. Mills cost $234 million to build and employed 4,200 workers. Mills generated $3.03 billion in annual textile exports compared to $578 million for raw cotton, adding $2.45 billion in value through processing. I analyzed textile mill economics demonstrating industrialization's transformative impact. Processing costs averaged $3.40 per kilogram, including labor, energy, and materials. Finished textiles sold for $8.90 per kilogram compared to $1.70 for raw cotton, adding $7.20 per kilogram in value. On 340,000 tons annually, processing generated $2.45 billion in gross value addition. After $1.16 billion in operating costs, net value addition was $1.29 billion annually, return on $234 million investment, 551% annually. Mills paid for themselves in 2.2 months and generated enormous profits thereafter. Employment impact was equally significant. 4,200 textile jobs paid average $12,000 annually, generating $50.4 million in wages, supporting 4,200 families. Workers developed skills in textile manufacturing, machine operation, and quality control. Mills created additional indirect employment in cotton transportation, equipment maintenance, and textile distribution. Total employment impact, approximately 12,000 jobs when including direct and indirect positions. Processing cotton into textiles demonstrated that industrialization was achievable and profitable. We didn't need foreign investment or technology that came with control. We purchased equipment from competitive suppliers. We hired technical assistants for initial setup. We trained workers to operate facilities. We developed management capability internally. We proved that Burkina Faso could industrialize successfully through determined effort and strategic investment. Generating solar electricity eliminated energy dependence while creating clean power for industries. We constructed solar farms with 890 megawatts capacity, providing electricity for mining operations, refineries, textile mills, and national grid. Solar farms cost $1.34 billion to build and eliminated $890 million in annual imported fuel costs. Solar power was cheaper than fossil fuel generation while being cleaner and more reliable. I calculated solar economics, proving renewable energy's financial and environmental benefits. Solar farms generated 2.2 billion kilowatt-hours annually at production cost of $0.04 per kilowatt-hour, including capital amortization. Equivalent electricity from imported fuel would cost $0.41 per kilowatt-hour, including fuel, transportation, and generation. Solar saved $0.37 per kilowatt-hour or $814 million annually in energy costs. Return on $1.34 billion investment, 61% annually. Solar farms paid for themselves in 1.6 years and provided free electricity thereafter for 25-year panel lifespan. Environmental benefits were substantial. Solar eliminated 1.8 million tons of CO2 emissions annually compared to fossil fuel generation. Solar reduced air pollution, improving public health. Solar used no water while fossil fuel plants required 12 million liters daily. Solar created energy independence, eliminating vulnerability to fuel price volatility and supply disruptions. Solar demonstrated that clean energy was economically superior to fossil fuels when full costs were considered. Smelting aluminum created high-value manufacturing from bauxite resources. We constructed aluminum smelter in Ouagadougou, processing bauxite into finished aluminum products. Smelter cost $2.1 billion to build and employed 890 workers. Smelter generated $8.9 billion in annual aluminum exports compared to $340 million for raw bauxite, adding $8.56 billion in value through processing. I analyzed smelter economics, demonstrating resource processing's transformative impact. Smelting costs averaged $1,000 $890 per ton, including energy, labor, and materials. Finished aluminum sold for $2,670 per ton, compared to $89 per ton for raw bauxite, adding $2,581 per ton in value. On 3.8 million tons of annual bauxite production yielding 1.9 million tons of aluminum, 50% conversion rate, smelting generated $5.07 billion in gross value addition. After $3.59 billion in operating costs, net value addition was $1.48 billion annually. Return on $2.1 billion investment, 70% annually. Smelter paid for itself in 1.4 years and generated substantial profits thereafter. Aluminum smelting demonstrated most dramatic value multiplication from resource processing. Bauxite worth $89 per ton became aluminum worth $2,670 per ton, a 30-fold increase in value. This multiplication occurred through applying energy, technology, and skilled labor to raw material. Every developed country followed this pattern: import cheap raw materials, add value through processing, export expensive finished products. We reversed the pattern by processing our own resources and capturing value that previously flowed abroad. We are achieving resource sovereignty that creates economic independence through controlling extraction, adding value through processing, and capturing profits from finished products. Resource sovereignty means we decide how resources are extracted, who extracts them, what environmental standards apply, how much employment is created, what processing occurs domestically, and how revenues are used for development. Economic independence means we finance development from our own resources rather than borrowing from foreign creditors. We employ our own people rather than depending on foreign investment, and we control our own economic destiny rather than following foreign dictates. Your exploitative contracts are canceled, your inflated costs are rejected, your transfer pricing is ended, your offshore profits are stopped, your theft is finished. We have state ownership instead of your extraction, we have refineries instead of raw exports, we have factories instead of your control, we have processing instead of your value capture, we have sovereignty instead of your theft. Contract cancellation occurred through legal process, documenting violations and offering compensation for legitimate investments while refusing payment for illegitimate profits from exploitation. We audited all mining contracts, identifying violations, including environmental damage, tax evasion, employment requirement failures, and local content obligation breaches. We calculated compensation as asset book value minus unpaid taxes, environmental remediation costs, and penalties for contract violations. Most companies accepted compensation, recognizing that fighting would expose their violations publicly and result in zero compensation. Some companies initially resisted but settled after we began criminal prosecutions for tax evasion and environmental crimes. Inflated cost rejection occurred through requiring state-owned companies to purchase equipment and services at competitive market prices. We established procurement systems requiring multiple bids for all purchases above $50,000. We hired independent auditors verifying that prices paid matched market rates. We terminated employees accepting kickbacks or steering contracts to overpriced suppliers. We saved $340 million annually through eliminating cost inflation that corporations had used to reduce taxable income. Transfer pricing elimination occurred through requiring state-owned companies to sell products at market prices to unrelated buyers. We sold gold through competitive auctions, ensuring we received full market value. We exported textiles to multiple buyers, preventing any single buyer from manipulating prices. We sold aluminum through international exchanges at transparent market prices. We captured full value of production instead of transferring profits offshore through manipulated prices. Offshore profit prevention occurred through state ownership, eliminating foreign parent companies that could extract profits through dividends, management fees, or other transfers. All profits from state-owned enterprises remained in Burkina Faso, available for reinvestment in expansion or distribution to government for public services. We ended the cycle where mining profits flowed to London, textile profits to Paris, and aluminum profits to New York, while Burkina Faso remained impoverished despite resource wealth. Theft termination occurred through comprehensive resource sovereignty, ensuring we captured full value of our resources. We controlled extraction through state ownership. We added value through domestic processing. We sold products at market prices. We captured all profits for national development. We ended 150 years of resource theft that began with colonialism and continued through nominally independent era under corporate extraction contracts. The transformation is spreading as African countries recognize that resource control generates prosperity while corporate extraction ensures poverty. Your era is finished. Our time is beginning. The change is unstoppable. The future belongs to Africa that controls its own gold, processes its own minerals, refines its own resources, manufactures its own products, and keeps 100% of the value. I proved it works. Others are following. We are seizing our resources permanently. The mathematics guarantee everything. 17 African countries nationalized mining operations between 2023 and 2025, following Burkina Faso's example. Democratic Republic of Congo nationalized cobalt mines. Zambia nationalized copper mines. Ghana nationalized gold mines. Tanzania nationalized diamond mines. Zimbabwe nationalized platinum mines. Each country adapted nationalization to their circumstances while following core principle of state ownership enabling value capture. 12 African countries established processing facilities between 2023 and 2025. Nigeria built oil refineries eliminating crude exports. Kenya constructed coffee processing plants adding value before export. Ivory Coast established cocoa processing facilities producing finished chocolate. Mozambique built natural gas processing plants. Each country recognized that processing generated more wealth than raw material exports. 19 African countries renegotiated resource contracts between 2023 and 2025, even when not pursuing full nationalization. They increased royalty rates from 3% average to 7% average. They raised corporate tax rates from 15% to 28%. They required local processing of specified percentages of production. They mandated employment and training of local workers. They inserted anti-transfer pricing provisions requiring market price transactions. Each improvement captured more value for host nations. I calculated continental impact of spreading resource sovereignty. 17 nationalizations generated $23.4 billion in additional annual government revenue. 12 processing facilities added $31.2 billion in annual value-added production. 19 contract renegotiations increased government revenues by $8.9 billion annually. Total annual benefit from resource sovereignty movement, $63.5 billion. Over 20 years, $1.27 trillion in additional wealth captured by African nations instead of transferred to foreign corporations. The mathematics guarantee everything because they prove that resource sovereignty generates dramatically more wealth than corporate extraction. Burkina Faso's 20-to-1 benefit-to-cost ratio demonstrates that nationalization costs are trivial compared to benefits. Continental resource sovereignty generating $63.5 billion annually proves that Africa can prosper by controlling our own resources. The $1.27 trillion in additional wealth over 20 years exceeds total Western aid to Africa, proving that ending extraction delivers more resources than accepting exploitation while receiving aid designed to make exploitation politically acceptable. Your era is finished because resource sovereignty movement has reached critical mass where success breeds success. Each nationalization proves feasibility and encourages others. Each processing facility demonstrates profitability and inspires replication. Each contract renegotiation shows that corporations will accept fairer terms rather than lose access completely. The momentum is unstoppable because mathematics prove sovereignty's superiority and examples demonstrate its achievability. Our time is beginning because resource sovereignty creates economic independence, enabling political sovereignty. Countries controlling their own resources can resist foreign pressure because they don't depend on foreign corporations for revenue or employment. Countries processing their own resources build industrial capacity and technical expertise. Countries capturing full value of resources finance development from their own wealth rather than borrowing from foreign creditors. Resource sovereignty is foundation for comprehensive sovereignty across all domains. The change is unstoppable because it's based on demonstrated success rather than theoretical promises. Burkina Faso's 50.5% GDP increase proves resource sovereignty works. 17 nationalizations prove it's replicable. 12 processing facilities prove value addition is profitable. 19 contract renegotiations prove corporations accept fairer terms. Success creates momentum that opposition cannot reverse through threats or propaganda because mathematics and evidence overwhelm rhetoric. The future belongs to Africa that controls its own gold, processes its own minerals, refines its own resources, manufactures its own products, and keeps 100% of the value. This future is inevitable because it's economically optimal and politically necessary. Economically, controlling resources and processing them generates more wealth than exporting raw materials and importing processed goods. Politically, sovereignty requires economic independence that only resource control provides. The combination of economic logic and political necessity makes resource sovereignty unstoppable, regardless of foreign opposition or corporate resistance. I proved it works through Burkina Faso's transformation. Others are following through, replicating our model. We are seizing our resources permanently through nationalization, processing, and value capture. The mathematics guarantee everything because numbers don't lie and evidence doesn't deceive. Resource sovereignty delivers prosperity. Corporate extraction ensures poverty. The choice is obvious. The outcome is certain. The transformation is permanent.